Greetings. I am Janelle Barranco, BKA Juicy J, and this is a review of the book Tongue Tied: Untangling Communication in Sex, Kink, and Relationships by Stella Harris. So, if I had to name this book in a way that communicated what I feel the author is trying to really relay, I would call it internal and external conversations as a space to notice what you like and find resources and support to communicate what you like and ultimately create more sexual well-being in your life. So, sexual well-being is a concept that I gained familiarity with as a result of the Mitchell article that we read in class. And they advocate for kind of teasing out and breaking down sexual well-being so that we can, as one of these four pillars, right, of sexual health. And this four pillars are sexual health, sexual rights, and sexual pleasure. While I was reading the article, it felt overwhelmingly clear to me, from my perspective, that sexual well-being felt almost foundational to allowing the others to really take form. And I'll tell a little story about why this was just so clear for me. So, I am Juicy J in my circles and play spaces, and I claim this name for myself as I was beginning my own personal evolution. I was turning 40, and I love how Harris says in the book, we're all woefully under sexually educated. We live in a sex negative culture. If you're 40, if you're 50, if you're 100 coming to this information, good for you because it's definitely a hard road, right? So I'm turning 40 and things just weren't, you know, I didn't I wasn't enjoying my life, and I was absolutely 100% at a pleasure deficit. And I looked at this midway point in my life and kind of felt like, whoa, something has to change. If my next 40 years look exactly like this, I don't know that that would be a 40 years I would personally be signing up for. So for me, very much like Garit Birnbaum explained in the TED Talk, sex was very much connected to my, impending sense of doom, or, nobody's getting out of here alive. And so if this is what it is, then it has to change. So I decided that I wanted to call in more pleasure. So I knew that, you know, life wasn't what I wanted to be. I was working a job I didn't enjoy. And so instead, what could make all of this more accessible? And I am so thankful for Black lesbian, queer, feminist writers, Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde, because they helped me realize that pleasure was necessary and that there were systems that were invested in my life not being pleasurable, and that perhaps it was a political act, a radical act to claim that for myself. So I started with pleasure, one of the other pillars of the four pillars that Mitchell names. And in this process, I realized that I couldn't access pleasure. Pleasure was not accessible to me. And one of the biggest things that came up for me was this social script that I was carrying. And can't really necessarily identify where it was birthed, but I can certainly see how it was, reinforced in various ways throughout my life. But this belief, this script that I was running that said, in order to, belong and be lovable and be able to show up, a person who is socialized as a woman has to be small. And this particular sexual script ran rampant throughout all of, it's a gendered script for sure, but it adversely affected my sexual well-being because, when we're talking about sexual safety and security, I absolutely never even felt safety and security was a goal. I had plenty of vulnerability because I wasn't in a space where I was able to advocate for myself, to feel any level of sense of self or embodiment in that sense of self. And so I was always, pandering for acceptance, and it never was about me. It was always centered from this space of me being othered and trying to become, lovable, basically. And so I really didn't experience sexual safety and security, and I certainly had very little sexual respect because, again, it was never centered on myself. So my personal identities were never able to bloom or, become known to me because I was always worried about presenting myself in a way that made me acceptable or lovable or someone who people would engage with, right? And so, as far as sexual self-esteem, it my personal self-esteem prior to getting on this, you know, mandatory pleasure train, if you will, I I didn't have any. Like, I obviously didn't feel good about my body because I wasn't trying to be in my body. I was always trying to shape shift myself into some other idea of a body, right? And so I lacked resilience in relation to sexual experiences, which, I will have to name that I was very thankful for the people who came into my life via social media, people like Alok Menon, people like, there were just so many, Adrienne Marie Brown for sure. There were many, influencers who kind of named, and Black queer and feminist writers who kind of named, like, hey, community is really important. And while community is the only thing that makes things sustainable. And so, in terms of my sexual relations, I didn't have a lot of resilience. However, there were seeds that were planted from other sources that kind of helped me realize that, oh, well, resilience is a goal. It's something that I should be pursuing, but um, there was certainly plenty of, coercive and compliant sexual. I mean, they were just rampant. I think for a long part, that's what kind of my own personal experience of sexuality was, because it was always about satisfying this other. And in the lit review by Kleinplatz, they talk a little bit about how this idea of compliant sex really, I guess clinicians were noticing that it created resentfulness within the partner that was doing the compliance. And so, ultimately that could make one shut down and tap out of any sexual experiences. And it also feels important to note that Chadwick mentioned that coercive sexual experiences, very often the person being coerced doesn't feel that they were non-consensual. And so there's this question about, coercive sexual experiences basically being inherently non-consensual. However, the person being coerced, if they don't have the education or the knowledge or the, you know, wherewithal, the entitlement, the well-being, if you will, to name that they are being coerced, then they may feel that they've given consent, right? And so that also goes into self-determination. For myself, there was definitely no self-determination, because once again, it was not about me. It was about, fitting myself into what I perceived other people's ideas were, which may or may not have been the case for everybody that I was interacting with. But this was fairly pervasive and really kind of shut me down at a psychosocial level, and which translated into my actual experiences. And I didn't have any comfort at all with my own personal sexuality, because it was never mine. It was always what I was trying to present in order to receive, right? And so from this space, this harmful script of, being small in order to, and being unseen in order to be lovable, I kind of reclaimed for myself as I was on this journey where I was moving from non-pleasure to pleasure. I reclaimed juiciness. I reclaimed the curviness. I reclaimed y- a lot more um, space by the name Juicy J. And so for me, this idea of sexual well-being is it's really foundational. I appreciate pleasure as being the invitation for me to have a more fulfilling life. However, without these, you know, 7 tenets, I don't think um, for me anyways, the other 3 pillars felt as accessible. So, Stella Harris does a good job of helping people find out what they want. She says you have to get in touch with yourself if you're going to communicate what you do and don't want. And to this end, she offers several activities that can help someone get to know themselves. So the first one is the sensations. The first ones that I'm going to cover is the sensations list. And this is really trying to get an idea of what it is that that makes sex worth wanting for you. It kind of gets at this idea in the Kleinplatz lit review, which I just completely loved, and in the article that we read earlier, both articles. I love this optimal sexual experience. The explanation that really stood out for me was utter embodiment within while being connected to another. I just love how vague yet extremely acute that is. It just felt so resonant to me, and I just really absolutely loved going into the optimal sexual experiences. And the idea of deep erotic intimacy, they left this, it was open and it was possible because of the languaging that they use. It felt like really poetic. And so yeah, like just reading them felt like optimal sexual experiences. Um, but it kind of, sensations exercise helps people to kind of identify what it is optimal for them, right? So how do you want to feel when you're having a sexual experience? Is it, you know, sharp or penetrated or curious or ticklish? They're kind of populating ideas or different feelings that people can can feel when they have sexual experiences. And so this is one way of getting to be able to name what it is that you want to feel, and kind of from there back into what that could look like in terms of the experience, right? So the next thing that I'll discuss is the idea of a yes, no, maybe list. And this is pretty straightforward. It's, what do, you know, are you a yes? Are you a no? Or are you a maybe when you think of certain sexual possibilities, right? It's an inventory. So there's things like kissing on here, public displays of affection, role playing, video sex. One of the ones that I had never heard of and had to look up, frottage, which is the practice of touching or rubbing against a clothed body of another person in a public space. And I had to kind of think about that because it was something that was certainly a maybe for me, and has probably even been a yes in the sense that it's already happened. But you know, what are the things that you see yourself open to? What would you consider doing? And kind of populating that list. Another thing that I really liked was this idea of like, what's your pizza? Like, what is the thing that is kind of just always accessible? It always kind of hits the spot, and that might not be pizza for you. So interchange that word for whatever. But for some people it might be coffee. For some people it might be, who knows, oatmeal or whatever. What is the thing that no matter what, if it's there, you'd probably go ahead and and partake, like a drink of water maybe. And so this idea that they're having a list of things that are kind of at the ready, that and they give the example of being read erotica while cuddling. And yes, for me, that definitely resonated. Like, it's important to have an idea of what you would be willing to do when you're presented with an opportunity to engage. So once you understand who it is that you are, how you want to feel, and how you want to show up as a sexual being, it's important to learn how to communicate this with others. So one idea they bring up is knowing how you refer to body parts. And this really stood out for me because for a long time I've always heard, you know, lots of different words, but referring to the genitals, the genital areas as down there, especially in as someone who socializes female, there's not like, vulva is something that for me wasn't ever heard until I was very much into being an adult and probably already had, a kid at that point. So it was cootie cats and which is fine, but also just knowing that words have power and it is important to name them in a way that doesn't make them inaccessible to you, in a way that allows you access, ways that allows you to show up and be curious and attach to your body parts versus to distance yourself away from them. So I felt like the body part words was really important, and then knowing what the other person wants to call their body parts, whoever you're engaging with in sexual encounters, kind of clarifying how they want their body parts to be called feels really important in overall sexual well-being to me. So one of the things they say is kind of learning how to be an empathetic listener, and learning to hear no, and how to process that. And of course, no always means no, but using no as this invitation to become more curious about what your partner or partners may be trying to communicate. Like they may be saying that there is education in this area that may be needed. There may be some sexual scripts that need to be unpacked. Just using no as a space to become curious, I thought is really valuable. However, I think it also merits noting that, you know, you definitely have to have a relationship dynamic that is built on sexual well-being for there not to be potential force or coercion coming in. So, and that goes for the same for this next concept that they mention, tiebreakers, where they use a lot of restaurant analogies here. But so, for example, or food analogies, I should say. For example, a tiebreaker would be, if we're deciding on dinner, you want Thai food and I want Indian food, we'd use the scale of 1 to 10, saying how much we want the food, how much we want to eat this particular food, and whoever has more wantingness indicated by a higher number on the scale. So if you say 8 for Thai food and I say 5 for Indian, then you would basically win. And yeah, again, that obviously Harris points out, like, this takes a lot of trust and communication in your relationship, because how would you know that the person isn't just, using power over dynamics to make their ideas more important or feel more necessary to the outcome? It just Sexual well-being for me is kind of assumed in this tiebreaker conversation. And the other thing they mentioned about the tiebreaker conversation was when someone, or under the tiebreaker section rather, so when someone offers you something that is a no. The person who turns it down is then responsible to offer up something that would be possible for them in that moment. And so in that to that end, like having that menu, if you will, or that toolkit of things that you're kind of always open to would be something that you could offer instead. I understood where they were coming from when they mentioned this. Personally, once again, it just feels like this is something that would necessarily, you'd have to have, a lot, overwhelming amount of sexual well-being already in your relationship. You'd already have to have a lot of safety and security and respect, trust. You'd have to have a lot of comfort. You're having a conversation with someone where if the dynamic isn't completely safe, then it has the potential to spiral down into something that is forceful and not ideal. So, yes, sharing with others. That was what we were just discussing. And I'll move towards my final thoughts, which are this was a good place to begin a conversation. And I think Harris would acknowledge that based on the book and based on the recommended reading, there was a robust recommended continued learning section. I think, again, for getting to know yourself, this is a great conversation starter. For learning to communicate with others, it's really important that these conversations be contained within a larger conversation of sexual well-being. So I think ultimately this book communicates that what you want is important, what you want is worth figuring out, and what you want is something that has to be actively worked at. I felt personally I felt an opportunity. So there's this concept also I mentioned earlier that Kleinplatz mentions about the resentfulness that people feel after engaging in, compliant sex as a result of wanting to avoid, a negative response from a partner. And there's another book that I read by Betty Martin called The Wheel of Consent, and they offer the wheel of consent as a way to at least have meaningful conversations for two people in partnership. And basically, they say, there's the giver of the gift and there's the receiver of the gift. And from that place, the conversation begins, right? Who is this for? So if I, as the giver, want to give you a yellow highlighter and you, as the receiver, are going to receive a gift from me, if it's for you, you would say, well, I don't want a yellow highlighter. I prefer pink. However, if it's for me, then it may be about the fact that I'm giving a gift. And so you might receive compliantly, you might receive this yellow highlighter because you see that it really makes me happy to give you a gift. But it kind of makes a space for this larger conversation where is there a space where I'm giving and I'm happy to give, but I'm giving you what you want to receive. And so a lot of times I think people are giving gifts that um, people don't want to receive. I made the joke in the discussions. It wasn't a joke. I just kind of explained in one of the discussion posts how I have a friend who, even though I've told them over and over again. Like, we've had the conversation. I am not Christian. I study African religions, and they literally send me, these Jesus text messages every morning, and it's alarming to me, and because I want to be in community, and this person, there's many dynamics here of why I accept this behavior, and we talk about it pretty openly, but I am compliant in the sense that I receive these messages that I don't want. And so, yeah, I do think there's an opportunity there for us to have a more fruitful conversation where we can actually be giving me something that I do want. But again, these are very, nuanced things that I think can happen in certain containers. And when you're realizing that as you're going through these things in the book and realizing that maybe there's some opportunity for you to have more sexual well-being, I think it's important to populate your life with those resources, right? So, yes, I am thankful that I read the book, thankful that I got exposed to the information, and I do feel it's a nice point to begin a journey, but obviously there's a lot more conversation to be had. Thank you for your time and your attention, sharing them with me. I understand them as very amazing, irreplaceable resources, and it really means a lot to me that you shared them with me. So thank you.